She had been invisible for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Every morning, Hazel Rowan Mercer woke before dawn, lit the stove with hands that knew the work better than they knew rest, and fed a town that never once bothered to learn her name. They called her the cook, sometimes worse. She was 24 years old and already moving through the world like a ghost, present, necessary, and utterly unseen. Then one dusty Tuesday in late July, a quiet man sat down at the end of the long table, took a single bite of her cornbread, and changed everything. Not with flattery, not with grand words, with 3 plain sentences that hit her harder than any cruelty ever had. Because they were true, and they were kind, and nobody in Dry Creek Crossing had ever offered her both at the same time. If this story speaks to you, stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. The summer that year arrived early and stayed mean. By the second week of July, the ground around Dry Creek Crossing had cracked into a patchwork of pale fissures, like old porcelain left too long in the sun. The creek itself, the one the town had been named for, had pulled back from its banks until it was little more than a brown trickle threading between exposed rocks. Cattle drovers coming in off the trail remarked that they hadn't seen dirt that thirsty since the drought of '71, and the old-timers at the hardware store would nod and say it was worse, actually, and then argue about exactly how much worse until whoever was listening got tired and walked away. The town of Dry Creek Crossing sat at the intersection of 2 freight roads in a part of the territory that wasn't beautiful and wasn't ugly. It was just functional, the way a tool is functional. There was a general store, a livery, a small land office that doubled as a post station, a saloon that smelled permanently of sour mash and regret, an alderman's boarding house, a 2-story structure of sun-bleached clapboard that offered travelers a bed, a bath if they paid extra, and 3 meals a day cooked by the woman who lived in the back room behind the kitchen. That woman was Hazel. Hazel Rowan Mercer had been born 24 years earlier in a farmhouse 2 days' ride east of here, the second of 5 children in a family that had more appetite than income. She'd learned to cook young, not because anyone sat down and taught her, but because someone had to, and she happened to be the one who paid attention. By the time she was 12, she was managing the family's food stores through lean stretches that would have broken a grown adult's spirit. By 15, she was doing it alone, because her mother's health had turned unreliable, and her father's attention had turned elsewhere. She'd come to Dry Creek Crossing 6 years ago, following a man she'd believed in. That story had a short ending and a long aftermath, and Hazel had spent the years since working at Alderman's boarding house, first as a general hand, then as the cook and the supply manager, and the one who patched the roof drains when they clogged and fixed the pump handle when it seized, and somehow kept the whole establishment running at a level of function that Clarence Alderman, the owner, consistently took credit for. Clarence Alderman was 53 years old, soft in the middle, and possessed of a confidence that had absolutely no relationship to his competence. He wore a vest every day, regardless of temperature, because he believed it made him look like a man of substance. He had hired Hazel 6 years ago at a rate of pay that was insultingly low, raised it twice in small increments since then, and spoke of her in town the way a man speaks of reliable equipment, with mild appreciation and the unspoken assumption that it would simply continue to function. He never asked her what she thought about anything. He never thanked her for anything specifically. He told people his boarding house had the best food in the territory, which was true, and took credit for it in the way a rooster takes credit for the sunrise. Hazel had made peace with this arrangement the way people make peace with bad weather, not because they like it, but because standing in the rain arguing with the sky doesn't accomplish anything. She did her work. She did it well. She kept herself small and quiet and out of the way of other people's opinions, which in a town like Dry Creek Crossing was the only real strategy available to a woman who looked like her. Because the other thing about Hazel, the thing that Dry Creek Crossing had apparently decided was its business to comment on, was her body. She was a big woman. Not just tall, though she was that too, at nearly 5'9". She was broad and solid in a way that the territory's particular brand of frontier judgment had decided was an appropriate target for public commentary. She'd heard every variation. She'd heard it from drovers passing through who thought cruelty was the same thing as wit. She'd heard it from women in town who dressed it up in concern and said things like, "You'd feel so much better if you just..." and then whatever they decided she should do differently. She'd heard it from Clarence Alderman himself, not viciously, just thoughtlessly, in the way he'd say the customer's like a cook who looks like she enjoys her own food and then laugh like that was a compliment. She had stopped flinching at it. That was the thing she was quietly most proud of. Not her cooking, not her supply management, not her ability to predict what the pantry would need 3 weeks out, but the fact that she had trained herself to hear those things and let them pass through her without landing. She had become very good at not landing. The morning Colton Briggs walked into Alderman's boarding house started the same way every other morning started. Hazel was up at 4:30 before the sky had made up its mind about what color it wanted to be. The kitchen was hers at that hour, completely, uncomplicatedly hers, and she moved through it the way she moved nowhere else in the world, with certainty. She knew where everything was without looking. She knew which burner ran hot and needed managing and which one had a lazy flame that needed coaxing. She knew the cast iron needed to preheat for 11 minutes before it was ready for cornbread batter. And she knew the batter itself needed to rest for at least 5 after mixing or the texture went sideways. She'd been making this cornbread since she was 10 years old, adjusting it over the years in small increments. A little less sugar than her mother's recipe, a little more fat. The addition of cracked black pepper that she'd started including about 3 years ago after a passing cook from Georgia had made her a version that changed her understanding of what the dish could be. She got the fire going. She started coffee. She set a large pot of water to heat for oatmeal and began pulling together the ingredients for the day's biscuit dough, because she always did biscuits and cornbread both for the morning meal. Biscuits for the people who wanted something light, cornbread for the people who needed to work. Outside, Dry Creek Crossing was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. By 6, the first of the boarders came downstairs, a pair of land surveyors who'd been staying for 2 weeks and would be gone by Friday, both of them quiet men who ate efficiently and said little. Hazel set their plates without being asked. She knew by now what each boarder preferred and in what quantity, and she operated the morning meal like a piece of machinery she'd spent years calibrating. By 7, the table was full. 8 boarders plus 3 locals who came in for breakfast because the alternative was whatever they could manage at home, and nobody wanted that. Hazel and her one assistant, a 15-year-old girl named Odie, who came in 6 mornings a week and was enthusiastic in a way that sometimes created more work than it saved, moved through the serving with the rhythm of a thing that had been done many times. The morning was hot already. It was not yet 8 o'clock and sweat had already gathered at the back of Hazel's collar. Clarence Alderman came downstairs at 7:15, poured himself coffee, stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, surveying the room with his hands in his vest pockets like a general reviewing his troops, said, "Looks good, Hazel," and went to go sit with the surveyors to talk about land values. Hazel watched him from across the room and thought nothing in particular. She'd stopped having thoughts about Clarence that rose to the level of feeling about 2 years ago. Yeah. The man came in just after 7:30. He wasn't remarkable, at first glance. Medium height, weathered the way men who work outside get weathered, not just in the face, but in the way they hold themselves, a kind of settled patience in the body that comes from years of dealing with things that don't cooperate on a schedule. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, Hazel guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of quiet that wasn't shy, the kind that came from someone who'd simply decided that he didn't need to announce himself. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way a careful man reads a new place, then found a spot at the far end of the long table where there was still space, set his hat down beside him, and waited. Odie went to see what he wanted. Hazel watched from the kitchen doorway while she wiped her hands on her apron. The man, she didn't know his name yet, ordered the full breakfast, which was eggs, salt pork, oatmeal, and bread. Hazel put together his plate the way she put together every plate, with attention. The eggs went on at the right temperature, so the whites were set but not rubbery. The salt pork came off the pan at the moment it was done, not past it. She cut the cornbread from the pan she'd made first thing, the pieces that had come out with the best color and rise, the corner pieces that she always liked herself but had long ago stopped keeping for herself. Because in a house full of people, you learn to take what was left. She set the plate in front of him herself, because Odie had gone to deal with a situation at the other end of the table involving a spilled coffee cup. She was back in the kitchen before he'd taken the first bite. She didn't watch people eat. She'd learned that watching people eat her food was a bad habit. It invited either the deflation of seeing someone eat without noticing or the particular anxious hope of waiting for a reaction, and she'd decided years ago that neither feeling was worth cultivating. So she was at the stove, starting on the cleanup and the prep for the midday meal, when she heard his voice. It wasn't loud. That was the first thing. He didn't call across the room. He spoke at a normal volume to Odie, who happened to be passing, and said, "Excuse me, the cornbread. Who made this?" Odie, bless her, said, "That's Hazel. She makes everything." A pause. Could I speak to her? Hazel had heard this before. Could I speak to her usually preceded either a complaint or occasionally a proposition of the sort she'd stopped engaging with years ago. She wiped her hands again, squared her shoulders in the small invisible way she'd developed for walking into conversations that might require armor, and came out from the kitchen. "I'm Hazel." The man looked at her, not in the way she was usually looked at, not the quick up and down that dismissed her before she'd spoken a word, but directly, the way you look at a person when you're actually trying to see them. "I'm Colton Briggs," he said. "I've got a cattle operation about 14 miles northwest of here. I've been on the trail for 3 weeks. He paused. He wasn't a man who used 10 words when 5 would do, she could already tell. "This is the best cornbread I've had in years." Hazel looked at him. She was waiting for the other half of the sentence. There was usually another half. "Best cornbread I've had, but it's a little sweet." Or "Best cornbread I've had, you should open your own place, shame about," and then whatever came next. The other half didn't come. He just looked at her, waiting, as if he'd said what he meant to say and was comfortable with it. "Thank you," she said, and was surprised to hear her own voice come out slightly unsteady. Not emotional. She wasn't going to be emotional about a compliment from a stranger, just surprised by the directness of it. "What's different about it, in your opinion?" It wasn't really a question the way she said it. It came out like she was testing whether he'd actually tasted it or was just being polite. He thought about it for a moment, which she noticed. Most people didn't think about it. "The fat," he said. "Most people underfat their cornbread and it comes out dry. Yours has the right texture, holds together without being heavy. And there's something else in it. Pepper, maybe." "Black pepper," she said. "Cracked, not ground." He nodded. "That's what it is. The pepper cuts the sweetness without announcing itself." She stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to do with a man who had just accurately analyzed her technique. In her experience, people either didn't notice or didn't care, and she'd built a complete life around neither mattering. "Will you be staying long?" she asked, because it seemed like the thing to say. "Tonight and tomorrow morning," he said. "I've got supply business to handle today." She nodded and went back to her kitchen. But the thing was, and this was the part that bothered her slightly, not in a bad way, but in the way of something she couldn't quite dismiss. The thing was that he'd been right. About all of it. The fat, the pepper, the balance. He hadn't stumbled into a compliment the way people sometimes did. He'd actually understood what he was eating. She found herself thinking about it while she worked through the morning. That hadn't happened to her in a long time. Not the compliment. She could count on one hand the compliments she'd received in 6 years that felt true rather than performative, but the specific sensation of being understood about something that mattered to her. The cooking mattered to her. Not because Clarence Alderman told her it did, but because she'd spent half her life learning it, refining it, thinking about it with the kind of attention that people usually reserved for things they loved. And a stranger passing through had sat down, tasted it, and seen it. She told herself it didn't mean anything. People said things. A man who knew food wasn't a different kind of man, necessarily, just a man who'd eaten enough of it to develop an opinion. She told herself this, and then went back to making the midday meal, and then went back to not thinking about it. Except that he came back for supper, which meant he'd handled his supply business and decided to eat at the boarding house again rather than at the saloon, which is where most single men ate their evening meals because the saloon had a cook who fried everything in the same grease and called it variety. Hazel noticed him come in. She noticed most people come in, sit. It was a professional habit, tracking who was at the table so she could manage portion estimates. But she noticed him specifically, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she had. He sat in the same spot. He ordered the full supper, which that evening was roasted chicken with root vegetables and gravy, cornbread again because she always made cornbread, and a dried apple pie she'd put together that afternoon. He ate without fanfare. She did not watch him eat. What she did do, and she would not have been able to explain why, was make sure the piece of chicken on his plate was the best one. The breast from the bird that had cooked most evenly, with the skin crisp the way it should be. She noticed herself doing it and told herself it was simply professional habit. It was not simply professional habit. The supper crowd that evening was loud. It usually was on Tuesdays, which Hazel had never been able to explain. Something about the rhythm of the week seemed to make Tuesday night men more likely to perform for each other. There were 6 drovers at the table who'd come in off a cattle trail and were in the mood for conversation, which, in their case, mostly meant talking over each other about things they were wrong about. Hazel moved through the supper service with Odie at her side, keeping plates full and coffee coming. She'd been doing this long enough that she could manage it on a kind of automatic competence. Her hands doing the work, while the part of her mind that was always slightly elsewhere cataloged the state of the pantry, made notes about what was running low, calculated how the week would go. The trouble started about 40 minutes into the meal. It started with a drover named Stills, she'd heard the others use the name, who was red-faced in the way that came from an afternoon of drinking rather than from sunburn, and who had apparently decided that the gap between himself and everyone else at the table needed to be filled with him being louder and meaner than anyone else. She was refilling coffee at the far end of the table when she heard him say it. Not loudly enough to address the whole room, yet, but loudly enough that the 3 men immediately around him heard it clearly. He was looking at her. He'd been watching her move around the table for the last several minutes, and now he'd decided to say what he'd been thinking. Hell of a lot of woman to be hauling that coffee pot. The men around him made the sounds men make when they're deciding whether to laugh, somewhere between a snort and silence, waiting to see which way it went. Hazel kept pouring. She'd heard worse this week. But Stills wasn't done. He'd gotten a reaction, which was enough encouragement. His voice climbed a register. How does Alderman afford the food bill? And then, because there was always a then, always an escalation, he said the third thing. The third thing was worse than the first 2 combined. It was personal and specific and designed to make the whole table hear it, and she saw, in the peripheral vision she'd developed for exactly this situation, several heads turn. She set the coffee pot down. She set it down carefully because the alternative was to do something with her hands that she would regret. She had been in this exact situation so many times that she knew every exit from it. She could leave the room. She could go back to the kitchen. She could say nothing, which was the strategy that had served her longest. She could make a mild remark that neither engaged nor retreated. She had a whole architecture of responses built for this exact moment, built from years of practice, and every single one of them required her to make herself smaller in some way. She was standing there, sorting through her options, when she heard the chair. It wasn't a dramatic sound, just a chair being pushed back from the table, but the particular quality of it, the deliberateness, made her look up. Colton Briggs had pushed his chair back and was standing up. He was not a physically intimidating man in the way that Stills was. Stills was broad and loud, and seemed to take up more space than his actual dimensions justified. Colton was medium-sized and quiet, but the way he stood up had a quality to it that made the immediate vicinity go still. He didn't look at Hazel. He looked at Stills. You want to say that again? His voice was flat and even, and it was about 60 degrees cooler than the room temperature. Stills blinked. He hadn't been expecting that. Most people at a table full of drovers don't push back on other drovers. Not over something like this. Not over a woman they didn't know. Just talking, Stills said. No, you weren't, Colton said. You were being loud on purpose and trying to see who'd laugh with you. He was still standing. He wasn't moving towards Stills. He was just standing there, with a kind of unhurried stillness that was somehow more threatening than movement. I'm not laughing, and neither is anyone else at this table, unless they want to explain their sense of humor to me personally. He looked around the table. The men who'd been on the edge of laughing looked elsewhere. Stills had the red-faced calculation of a man who was weighing his options and not finding good ones. Colton Briggs didn't look like a man who made threats he didn't intend to keep, and in a territory where there were very few referees, that was a relevant consideration. Wasn't trying to start trouble, Stills said, with the diminished energy of a man executing a retreat. Then don't start it, Colton said. He looked at Stills for another moment, just long enough to make the point, and then he sat back down and picked up his fork. The table went back to being loud in the way tables go loud when they want to cover the absence of something that just happened. Hazel stood absolutely still for one moment. She picked up the coffee pot. She went back around the table, filling cups, because that was the thing to do. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that her hands were steady. When she got to Colton's end of the table, she filled his cup. He didn't make it a thing. He didn't look up at her with the expression of someone expecting gratitude. He just held his cup slightly toward her and said quietly, without looking away from his plate, "Good gravy. Whatever you put in it. Pan drippings and a little apple cider vinegar," she said. "Cuts the fat." He said, and went back to eating. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of it, and breathed. Not because she was crying. She wasn't crying. She was 24 years old, and she hadn't cried over something like this in years. She was breathing because something had shifted quickly and without warning, and she needed a moment to find her footing. Nobody had done that for her before. That was the honest truth of it. In 6 years at this boarding house, not one person had done that. There had been kind people. The surveyors were pleasant men. There were regulars who treated her with ordinary courtesy. There had been women who smiled at her in the market and meant it. But nobody had stood up, not for her specifically in front of people, in a way that would cost them something. She let herself acknowledge that for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up the dish she needed and went back out to finish the service. The next morning, his last morning at the boarding house, he came down for breakfast at 6:45. Earlier than most boarders, and Hazel was still in the middle of the morning prep. Odie hadn't arrived yet. The kitchen was hers alone. He knocked on the door frame of the kitchen doorway. People didn't usually do that. The kitchen had an invisible threshold that most people didn't bother respecting. "You mind if I get a cup of coffee in here? Dining room table isn't set yet." "Pot's on the stove," she said. He poured his own cup, which she also appreciated. The not waiting to be served, the treating the kitchen as a utilitarian space rather than a stage. He leaned against the counter and drank his coffee while she worked. He didn't talk immediately, which she also appreciated because she was in the middle of the biscuit dough and needed to think about it. After a while, he said, "How long have you been here?" 6 years. "At this boarding house? In this town?" "You from around here originally?" "East," she said. 2 days east." He nodded. "Ranch country out there." "My family farmed. Small operation. We were not successful at it." She said it matter-of-factly because it was a fact. "A lot of families weren't," he said. "The land out here doesn't forgive mistakes the way land back east supposedly does." "Is that where you're from? Back east?" "Kentucky," he said. "Long time ago now." She got the biscuit dough into the pan and slid it into the oven. She wiped her hands and poured herself the half cup of coffee she allowed herself before the service started. Any more than that on an empty stomach made her hands uncertain. "Your operation," she said. "You said it was struggling." He looked at her. She'd been paying attention the previous morning, apparently, and he registered that. "It's manageable," he said. "The cattle are fine. The operations side is a mess. My foreman handles the herd well enough, but nobody's managing supplies or planning ahead for the lean stretches. We ran short on feed twice last winter. That's not a management problem. That's a planning problem." Hazel thought about this. "What's your winter head count?" He told her. She did the math in her head, the way she'd been doing supply math since she was 12 years old. "You'd need to start building the winter supply in September at the latest to be safe," she said, "and you'd need to account for 2 additional weeks on top of your longest expected winter stretch, because out here, the weather adds time that the calendar doesn't predict." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's exactly right," he said. "It's arithmetic," she said. "It's arithmetic that nobody at my ranch is doing." She went to check the biscuits. She could feel his eyes on her, not in the way she was used to feeling people's eyes, assessing, dismissing, but in the way of someone who was rethinking something. She pulled the biscuits out, checked the color, put them back in for 2 more minutes. "You manage the supplies here?" he asked. "I manage the cooking and the supplies, yes, and the repairs when Clarence doesn't want to pay someone to do them, and the scheduling when Odie's sick, and the—" She stopped herself. "Yes, I manage the supplies." "Does Alderman know that's what he's got in you?" "Clarence knows he has a cook," she said, which is technically accurate. Colton Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to be in town through tomorrow afternoon. My supply business is taking longer than I thought. A pause. I'd like to talk to you about the ranch, about possibly coming on in a different capacity than you're working in here. Hazel turned and looked at him directly. You're offering me a job. I'm offering to have a conversation about one, he said. I'm not going to make you an offer before I know whether it's an offer you'd want to hear. She looked at him for a moment. The biscuits were done. She could smell the right point. She always could, even without looking at them. She turned back to the oven, pulled them out, set them on the rack to cool. All right, she said. Come back at 2. Clarence takes his nap after the midday meal, and I have about an hour to myself. He nodded. I'll be here. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and went out to wait for breakfast to be set. The hour between 12:30 and 1:30 was the closest thing to private time that Hazel had in her day. Clarence disappeared upstairs after the midday meal as reliably as the sun set in the west. It was his only truly predictable quality. And Odie left at noon because she had other work in the afternoon. The kitchen was hers, and the back step that looked out over the scrubby yard behind the boarding house was hers too. And she sometimes sat there with her feet on the packed earth and let herself be tired for a few minutes without it meaning anything. She was sitting on the back step with a glass of water she wasn't really drinking when she heard the side gate open. Colton Briggs came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her sitting on the step. He looked faintly uncertain for the first time, like he'd been expecting to knock on a door and wasn't sure about the etiquette of finding someone in their private moment. Come sit down, she said, because it was easier than making him figure it out. He came and sat on the step beside her. There was enough room for both of them, with a foot of space between them. She waited. He was a man who organized his thoughts before he spoke. She'd already noticed this. It was an unusual quality. Most people spoke to fill silence. He seemed to understand that silence was just the space between things that mattered. The ranch is called the Briggs Hartley, he said. It was started by my father and his partner 40 years ago. Hartley's been gone for 20 years. His widow sold her half to my father. I bought my father's half 10 years ago when he decided he was done with the work. He said this without particular emotion. It's a 1,000-acre operation. We run about 300 head, and we could run more, but I don't have the management structure to support growth right now. What's your revenue situation? She asked. He told her. It was a straightforward cattle operation, seasonal income from drives, supplemental income from selling to local ranchers, a smaller but consistent line from supplying the garrison 20 miles north. Your feed costs are too high, she said. If you're running short in winter, you're buying emergency supply at the worst possible price. Early purchase at summer rates would save you. I'd have to see the actual numbers, but based on typical market patterns, probably 30 to 40% on the winter feed line. He was looking at her. I'm talking about managing the ranch's supply and provisions, he said. Full scope, kitchen, food for the hands, feed for the herd, seasonal planning, inventory management. The position would also involve some oversight of the supply budget across the whole operation. That's not a cook's job, she said. No, he said. It's not. She looked out at the yard. A hen was doing something unconvincing near the fence line. What would it pay? She asked. He named a figure. It was more than she was making at Alderman's, showing more than she'd been making at Alderman's even after the raises, and by a margin that was not small. She thought about Alderman's. She thought about the kitchen she'd spent 6 years making perfect. She thought about the back step she was sitting on right now, which was the only piece of geography in this entire town that felt like hers. She thought about Stills and the way the table had gone quiet. She thought about the biscuit dough she'd made this morning that had come out correctly, the way it always came out when she let herself pay attention to it, and how nobody in this building had ever noticed the difference between when she was paying attention and when she was going through the motions. I would need to see the ranch, she said. Before I make any decision, I need to see what I'd be walking into. That's reasonable, he said. I'll be here through tomorrow. If you're willing to ride out with me in the morning, I can show you the property and the setup and answer whatever questions you have. And if I have 100 questions, then we'll ride slow, he said. She looked at him sideways. It was the closest thing to humor she'd heard from him, and it surprised a small noise out of her. Not quite a laugh, but the precursor to one. All right, she said. Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. "I'll have horses ready," he said. He stood, and she noticed that he did it without making a production of it. Just stood up, the way a person who is comfortable in their own body stands up. "Miss Mercer," he said. Not Hazel, not yet, but Miss Mercer, which was a courtesy she hadn't been extended in longer than she could accurately remember. "Thank you for your time." "Thank you for the conversation," she said. He went back through the side gate. She sat on the step for a few more minutes, her glass of water warming in her hands, looking at the cracked earth of the yard and the hen that was still doing something unconvincing near the fence. Something was shifting. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather. Not in the specific details yet, but in the pressure of the air against your skin. She told herself to be careful. She told herself to be careful before, and it hadn't always helped, but she told herself anyway. Then she went back inside to start supper. She told Clarence at the end of that evening's service. She didn't plan the conversation. She didn't think a planned conversation with Clarence was likely to go differently from an unplanned one, so she simply waited until he was finishing his supper coffee and said, "I'm going to be riding out in the morning to look at a ranch operation. I'll be back by early afternoon. Odie can manage breakfast if she comes in at 5 instead of 6. Clarence looked at her over his coffee cup with the expression of a man who hadn't been informed of something he considered his business. "What ranch operation?" "Briggs Hartley, the man who's been staying here the past 2 nights. "Briggs." Clarence thought about this. "He's looking for a cook?" "He's looking for a supply manager," she said, "with cooking responsibilities." Something moved across Clarence Alderman's face. She watched it happen. First surprise, then something more complicated. Not quite the response of a man who was going to fight to keep her, but not quite the response of a man who was entirely indifferent either. Somewhere in the middle, which was honestly about what she'd expected. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked. I'm thinking about going to look at a property," she said, "and I'm letting you know so you can make sure Odie comes in early." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she thought he was going to say something. Something that might have mattered, something that might have been the conversation they'd never actually had about what she contributed and what it was worth. She saw him line up the words. Then he put his coffee cup down and said, "Well, tell Odie 5 o'clock then." Hazel nodded. She went to finish cleaning the kitchen. That night, in the narrow bed in the room behind the kitchen, she lay in the dark and did what she always did when something was changing. She ran the inventory. What she had, a job that was stable, a kitchen she knew, a routine that worked, the particular invisibility of a place where everyone had already decided what she was and stopped looking, what she might be leaving, a man who thanked her for asking her for help, the first sincere compliment she'd received in years, the back step, 6 years of hard work that had made something out of nothing. What she might be gaining, she didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. She didn't know. She'd been wrong about what she'd be gaining before. And the cost of that particular mistake had been 6 years in this narrow bed, in this small room in a town that called her the cook, and moved on. But she was 24 years old, and she'd spent 6 years disappearing, and the disappearing hadn't made her safe. It had just made her invisible. She thought about Colton Briggs standing up from that table. She thought about the way he'd said Miss Mercer, the particular weight of it. She thought about him saying it's the best cornbread I've had in years, and meaning it, and understanding why. The heat pressed in through the single window. Outside, Dry Creek Crossing was quiet in the way of a place that didn't care what you decided. Hazel stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she closed her eyes and made herself sleep. Because she had to be up at 4:30, and whatever was coming, she needed to be rested for it. She was up before 4:30. She hadn't slept badly, exactly. She'd slept the way she always slept when something was sitting on her chest, which was in short stretches with a kind of watchful incompleteness, the body resting while the mind kept one eye open. By 4, she'd given up pretending and gotten dressed in the dark. And by 4:15, she was in the kitchen with the fire going and the coffee on, doing the morning prep out of habit, even though Odie would be in at 5 to handle the breakfast service without her. She made the cornbread anyway. It settled her to make it. The familiar sequence of measuring and mixing, the pan going into the oven at the right temperature. The 11 minutes of waiting she used to get the rest of the prep in order. She wasn't going to be here to serve it, but she left it covered on the counter with a note for Odie explaining the timing on the eggs and which boarders took their coffee before their food, and which ones would complain if it arrived at the same time. She packed what she needed in a small canvas satchel, a notebook, because she intended to ask specific questions and write down the answers, a pencil, a change of gloves for the ride back, and a biscuit wrapped in cloth from the pan she'd made the previous afternoon. She hadn't eaten yet, and she wasn't sure when she would. At 5:50, she went out the front of the boarding house into a morning that was already warm, the sky doing its slow business of becoming light in the east, and found Colton Briggs at the end of the front walk with 2 horses. He was on time. She noted that. "You eat?" he asked. "Not yet." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a strip of dried beef without ceremony, held it out. She took it. They stood there in the early morning quiet, eating breakfast on their feet, like people who had places to be, and then he checked the saddle on her horse, not making a production of it, just checking it, and they rode out of Dry Creek Crossing in the growing light without much said between them. It was 14 miles to the Briggs Hartley, and they made it in a little under 2 hours, which meant he wasn't pushing the pace on her behalf, but wasn't loitering either. The land between Dry Creek Crossing and the ranch was the kind that looked empty unless you knew how to read it. Scrub grass and scattered rock, and the occasional dry wash cutting through the earth, and a line of hills in the north that turned blue in the morning light. Hazel had spent 6 years not leaving town and had forgotten that the territory had this quality to it when you were moving through it on horseback. The particular silence of open land, with nothing between you and the sky. They talked as they rode. Not continuously, but in the way of 2 people who were both comfortable with quiet and didn't feel compelled to fill it with noise. He told her about the ranch, the history, the current hands, the problems. She asked specific questions and wrote in her notebook when she got specific answers. He didn't talk around anything, which she appreciated. He said the foreman was a good man with cattle and a poor man with numbers, and that the previous attempt at a cook had lasted 8 months before leaving for reasons Colton described as an incompatibility of temperament and expectations, without elaborating. She didn't push him on it. She asked about the hands. He had 8 full-time and could use 10, ages ranging from 19 to a man named Rowley Fitch, who was somewhere in his 60s and had been on the property since Colton's father ran it and seemed likely to die there, which Colton said without particular sadness, just as a fact about the landscape of the ranch, the way you'd note a rock formation that had always been there. "How do they eat currently?" she asked. "Adequately," he said, which means not well. "What does that mean in specifics?" He told her. The previous cook, during his tenure, had managed breakfast and a midday meal for the hands in the field, with a cold supper most evenings. The quality was functional and no more. Since the cook left, the foreman's wife had been stepping in 3 times a week as a favor, and the other days the hands were managing on their own, which meant salt pork and whatever they could heat over a fire. Hazel wrote this down. "You're losing productivity," she said. "Men who eat badly work badly, not because they're lazy, because the body runs on fuel, and poor fuel makes for poor performance over a sustained period." He looked at her sideways from his horse. "That's also exactly right," he said. "It's also arithmetic," she said. The corner of his mouth did something. Not quite a smile, but the structural antecedent of one. They rode on. The ranch came into view from the top of a low rise, and Hazel pulled up her horse without intending to and just looked at it for a moment. It was not a handsome property. She wanted to be honest about that with herself, because she'd made the mistake before of arriving somewhere and letting the hope she'd invested in the journey color what she was actually seeing. The Briggs Hartley was a working ranch with a working ranch's particular aesthetic, which is to say, it was functional and worn and built for durability rather than appearance. The main house was a 2-story structure that had been added to over the years in ways that didn't entirely agree with each other. The original build was stone, and someone had added a wooden wing at some point that had weathered to a different color. There were outbuildings, a substantial barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, and what she assumed was the kitchen and cook shed built off the side of the main house. The whole thing had the look of a place that had been good once and was currently in the early stages of letting that slip. "How long has it been understaffed?" she asked. "About 2 years," he said. "After my foreman's wife got sick, she stopped being available to fill in on ranch work, which meant he was spending more time at home, which meant less oversight. Things drift when nobody's watching them. She could see that. It was there in small ways. A fence post that needed resetting, a pile of lumber that had been delivered and not moved, a water trough that was running lower than it should be in mid-morning. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was the kind of thing that accumulated into a problem if it went unaddressed. "Show me the kitchen," she said. Bottom. The kitchen was bad, not dirty, exactly. The foreman's wife had enough dignity about her work that she'd kept it clean, but badly organized, under-equipped for the number of people it needed to serve, and stocked in a way that made no sense to anyone who understood supply management. There were 3 different kinds of dried beans and almost no cornmeal. There was enough salt to preserve a small horse, but not enough fat for a week's worth of cooking. Someone had bought a crate of a canned fruit that nobody had opened, stacked against the wall like a monument to poor planning. Hazel stood in the middle of the kitchen and did a slow inventory with her notebook. She opened every cabinet. She checked the root cellar, which had exactly the problem she'd expected. Too much of the wrong things and gaps in the essentials. She looked at the stove, which was adequate but needed a proper cleaning and had a flue issue she could see from the soot patterns on the wall. Colton stood in the doorway and let her work. She appreciated that he didn't hover or explain things that were self-evident. He answered questions when she asked them and otherwise stayed out of her way. "Your feed storage for the herd," she said. "Where is it?" He took her to the barn. She looked at the feed situation with the same methodical attention. She was calculating things in her head as she walked. Current stock levels against seasonal need, the gap between what was here and what would be needed, the earliest point at which those purchases needed to be made to catch summer pricing. "You'll be short by November," she said. "Not critically short, but short enough that you'll be paying winter prices for the difference. That's the same problem you had last year." "Same problem I had the year before that," he said. "Do you want to fix it, or do you want to keep paying the premium?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to fix it." "Then you need someone making these purchasing decisions in July and August, not October," she said. "The information isn't complicated. It's just that nobody's been working the numbers early enough." She closed her notebook and looked at him directly. "What exactly would the role be?" she said. "Not the general description, the specifics. Who do I report to? Who has authority over the supply budget? What decisions would I make independently versus bring to you?" He answered every question without deflecting. She reported to him directly. The supply budget for kitchen and provisions would be her purview to manage within parameters they'd agree on together. Feed procurement she'd coordinate with the foreman, Jed Marsh, but the final decisions on timing and volume would be hers after consulting with Colton on the larger numbers. She'd have authority to set the kitchen schedule and manage the hands' meal service without having to get approval for every decision. "The hands," she said. "Some of them are going to have opinions about a woman managing the supply budget." "Some of them will," he said. "That's not a denial." "No," he said, "it's not. I won't pretend it'll be simple, but my name is on this property and I'll make the position clear." She looked at the barn around her, at the organized imperfection of it, the tack that was well maintained even if everything else was slipping, the signs of a man who cared about the right things but had been stretched too thin to attend to all of them. "I need to think about it," she said. "That's fair," he said. "Not because I'm uncertain about the work," she added, and she meant it specifically. She wanted him to understand what the hesitation was and what it wasn't. "I can do this work. I know I can. I'm uncertain about leaving somewhere I understand for somewhere I don't." He nodded slowly. "That's the honest version of the concern," he said, "and I don't have a way to resolve it for you. I can tell you what I intend and what I'll do, but I can't make that feel known the way 6 years of history feels known." It was one of the more perceptive things anyone had said to her in recent memory. She wrote it down, which surprised her, and then felt slightly self-conscious about having done it in front of him. He didn't remark on it. They rode back toward Dry Creek Crossing with the afternoon sun beginning its downward arc, and she was quiet for most of it, working through the numbers in her head, running the variables, looking for the calculation that would make the answer clear. There wasn't one. That was the thing about this kind of decision. It didn't resolve into arithmetic, no matter how hard you pushed it. At some point, you ran out of knowable information, and what was left was just risk, and the question of how much risk you were willing to carry. She was quiet until they were about 2 miles out from town, And then she said without preliminary, "I'll do it." He turned his head. "I need 2 weeks to give Clarence proper notice," she said, "and I need the agreement in writing before I leave, what the position is, what it pays, what my authority covers. Not because I don't trust your word, but because written terms protect both of us." "That's reasonable," he said. "I'll have it drawn up before I leave tomorrow." "And one other thing," she said. She'd been working out how to say this for most of the ride and had decided that direct was the only way that worked. "What happened at the supper table the other night? I don't need that. I'm not asking you to fight my battles." He seemed to consider this carefully before responding. "I wasn't fighting your battle," he said. "A man at that table was being a particular kind of ugly, and I had a problem with it. That's different from fighting your battle." "Is it?" "I think so," he said. "You were handling it. I could see that. What I did wasn't because I thought you couldn't. It was because I didn't want to sit there and be a man who watched it happen and said nothing." She thought about this for a moment. "All right," she said. "That's a distinction I can accept." They rode the last 2 miles in comfortable silence. She told Clarence that evening. She'd intended to be straightforward and unequivocal, and she was, though it landed harder than she'd expected. Not because Clarence was sentimental, but because the reality of the situation took him a few minutes to actually absorb. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she confirmed. Long enough for you to find someone. There are women in town who can cook. I can speak to a couple of them if you'd like recommendations. I know who can cook in this town, he said, with a sharpness that was mostly pride. Then you'll be fine, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him go through the various positions available to him. Irritation, calculation, the wounded dignity of a man who hadn't seen something coming. Then he landed on something that surprised her. You've been here 6 years, he said. Yes. And you're good at what you do. She waited. Better than I've said, probably, he said, and looked away when he said it, which told her it cost him something. It was the closest he was going to get to an apology for 6 years of not saying the thing, and she knew it. Yes, she said, better than you've said. He nodded. He didn't look at her. Well, 2 weeks. She went back to the kitchen. Deet. The 2 weeks passed the way departure times always pass, both quickly and with a strange elongation of certain ordinary moments. She found herself paying attention to things she hadn't consciously registered in years. The particular quality of the morning light through the kitchen window, the exact weight of the cast iron pan, the sound of Dry Creek Crossing waking up outside while she got the fire going. Odie cried, which Hazel had not predicted and which required her to stand very still in the kitchen for a minute, her hand briefly on the girl's shoulder, not quite sure what to do with someone else's emotion about her leaving when she was still figuring out her own. You'll be fine, Hazel told her. You know how to do this. I know how to do it because you taught me, Odie said. Then it's still in the building, Hazel said. It didn't leave just because I'm leaving. She thought about that for the rest of the day, whether the things you taught stayed somewhere or whether they went with you. She didn't reach a conclusion. Icky. She also, during those 2 weeks, spent several evenings doing something she'd been neglecting at the boarding house, though she'd never let herself frame it that way. After the kitchen was closed and Clarence was settled and the house was quiet, she'd been in the habit of going out the back and sitting on the step. And sometimes, not every night, but sometimes, a few of the children from the street would appear. Not invited, never by her explicitly, just appearing, the way children do when they know a place is safe and the person there won't send them away. She'd been feeding them for about 2 years. Leftovers, mostly. The end of a bread loaf, the remainder of a pot of beans, things that would otherwise be thrown out or saved for Clarence's lunch the next day. She'd never talked about it, never counted it, never thought of it as a particular kind of act. It was just a thing that happened in the back step quiet of the late evening. On her second to last night, there were 4 of them. 2 brothers, about 8 and 10, whose father drove freight and whose mother worked at the laundry and whose dinner situation was, she'd come to understand, inconsistent. A girl of about 7 named Penny, who lived 3 houses down and had a look in her eyes that Hazel recognized in the particular way you recognize something you've seen in a mirror. And a boy she didn't know. New to the street, she thought, or at least new to appearing on her step, who ate with the focused efficiency of someone who didn't take meals for granted. She gave them what she had. She'd made extra that day, which was not a coincidence. The oldest boy, the 10-year-old whose name was Cal, said, "You leaving, Ms. Hazel?" She looked at him. "Who told you that?" "Everybody knows," he said. "Town ain't that big." "I'm leaving in 2 days, yes." He was quiet for a moment, working through something. Then, "The new place gonna be better?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He considered this. "You scared?" "Yes," she said, because he was 10 and he deserved a straight answer. "A little." He nodded, like this was satisfactory information, like the fact that she was scared and going anyway was the part that mattered. She thought about that too. The night before she left, she did not sleep at all. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room and stared at the ceiling and ran through the inventory of everything she was leaving. Not the things she'd cataloged before, the practical balance sheet, but the other things, the ones that didn't have numbers. The particular silence of this room at 4 in the morning, the way the fire caught in the kitchen stove when the wood was dry, the back step. 6 years was not nothing. 6 years of doing the same thing badly paid and under-acknowledged was also not nothing. It was 6 years of her life, and even a life spent in a place that didn't fully see you was a life, and leaving it meant admitting that the next 6 years should be different, and that was a larger admission than she was entirely comfortable with. She was not a woman who asked for much from the future. She'd learned that lesson early. You ask for things, and then you calculate how much it costs you when they don't arrive, and after enough iterations you find the asking price too high. She'd reduced her asks to the functional minimum: steady work, fair pay, a room of her own. What Colton Briggs was offering wasn't dramatically outside that range, on the surface. It was work. It was better pay. It was a room, presumably, though they hadn't discussed specifics of housing, which she added to her mental list of things to clarify. But it was also something else, and she knew it, and she'd been trying not to let herself know it because it was the most dangerous thing to want. The possibility of being seen for what she actually was in a place where she might actually stay. That was the risk. Not the work. She could do the work. The risk was that she'd arrive at this place and try to be seen and fail at it, the way she'd failed at it before, and then she'd have the particular loneliness of someone who moved toward something and found nothing there. She could stay in Dry Creek Crossing, where the loneliness was at least familiar. That was the calculation she ran until nearly 2 in the morning, until she was tired enough of running it that she told herself to stop. She was going. She'd already said she was going. The agreement was in writing, signed by both of them, folded in her notebook. She was going because the woman who stayed in Dry Creek Crossing forever, invisible, well-organized, feeding children on the back step in the dark, and calling it enough, that woman had a life that worked in a technical sense and didn't work in any other sense. And Hazel was 24 years old and not willing to sign the rest of her life over to a thing that only technically worked. She closed her eyes. She got 3 hours of sleep, which was less than she needed and more than she'd expected. She was packed and ready at 5:45. Her things fit in one trunk and a saddlebag, which was a commentary on 6 years she didn't let herself think about too hard. She left the kitchen cleaner than she'd found it. She left notes for Odie on every process she could think of: the biscuit timing, the cornbread proportions, the winter supply schedule that she'd put together out of professional habit and left on the counter because whoever came next would need it, and she'd be damned if she'd take it with her out of spite. She carried the trunk to the front step herself. Clarence appeared in the doorway in his vest. He'd gotten up earlier than usual, which she noticed, and stood watching her with his hands in his pockets. "You've got everything?" he said. "Everything I came with," she said. He nodded. He seemed to want to say something else. She waited, but it didn't come. What came instead was Colton Briggs turning the corner at the end of the street with a wagon, not horses this time because she had luggage, moving at a steady pace through the early morning. He pulled up, got down, loaded her trunk into the wagon bed without comment, and came around to help her up to the seat. She didn't need the help, but she took his hand anyway because it was offered as courtesy and not condescension, and she could feel the difference. She looked back at the boarding house once as they pulled away. Clarence was still in the doorway. Odie had appeared beside him, her face doing complicated things. Hazel raised one hand briefly. Then she faced forward. The wagon moved out through the quiet streets of Dry Creek Crossing, out onto the freight road, and the town pulled back behind her the way towns do when you're leaving them, shrinking steadily until it was just a cluster of shapes against the morning sky, and then the road curved and it was gone. She sat beside Colton Briggs on the wagon bench with her satchel in her lap and her notebook inside it, and all the things she couldn't quantify somewhere in her chest, settling slowly into whatever shape they were going to take in this new version of her life. The sun was coming up ahead of them, the road running straight into it, the land on either side going gold as the light found it. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "The room. We didn't discuss housing specifics." "There's a room in the main house," he said, "off the kitchen. It's small, but it has its own door to the outside." Its own door to the outside, she noted that. "And a window?" she asked. "South-facing," he said. She nodded. That would do. They drove on into the morning, and the road to the Briggs Hartley unfolded ahead of them, and Hazel Rowan Mercer kept her eyes forward and her hands steady in her lap, and let herself, very carefully, begin. The room off the kitchen was small in the way that honest rooms are small. Not cramped, but specific. There was a bed, a chest of drawers, a wooden chair, and the south-facing window Colton had mentioned, which let in a rectangle of afternoon light that moved across the floor as the day progressed. Hazel unpacked her trunk in about 20 minutes, arranged her things in the drawers in the order that made sense to her, and then stood at the window looking out at the rear yard of the Briggs Hartley and gave herself exactly 5 minutes to feel whatever she was going to feel about being somewhere new. What she felt was mostly tired, and underneath the tired, something quieter that she didn't examine too closely. Not hope exactly, more like the absence of the particular weight she'd been carrying out of Dry Creek Crossing. The weight of 6 years of a place that had already decided what you were. After 5 minutes, she went to the kitchen and started taking inventory. This was her nature and her method, and the thing that had kept her functioning through every difficult stretch she'd navigated. When in doubt, find out what you're working with. The kitchen at the Briggs Hartley looked worse in the morning light than it had on her first visit 2 weeks ago, which was partly the light and partly that she was looking at it now as her responsibility rather than as a problem she was evaluating from a distance. The difference in perspective made everything more specific. She worked through the pantry with her notebook, writing down every item, the quantity, the estimated remaining shelf life. She checked the root cellar again, more carefully this time. She opened the smoke shed and assessed the cured meats situation. She found 2 things she hadn't noticed on the first visit. A secondary storage room off the barn that contained a decent quantity of preserved goods that someone had put up and then apparently forgotten about, and a small herb bed outside the kitchen door that had gone to seed but could be salvaged if anyone paid attention to it in the next week. She was on her hands and knees pulling weeds from the herb bed. Not because it was urgent, but because it was there and it was bothering her. When she became aware of being watched, she looked up. There were 2 men standing near the barn, not doing anything in particular, watching her. One was young, maybe 20, with the angular look of someone who hadn't quite grown into his frame yet. The other was older, mid-40s, with a drover's build and the kind of face that had made a permanent habit of skepticism. She held their gaze for a moment, then went back to the weeds. "Didn't know Colton hired a gardener," the older one said. He was saying it to the younger one, but at a volume calculated to carry. Hazel finished the section she was working on before she responded. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and looked at him directly. "He didn't," she said. "I'm the supply manager. These are culinary herbs, and they were dying from neglect. Is there something I can help you with, or were you just passing by?" The older man, she'd learn later his name was Deke Sandoval, 12 years on the ranch, considered himself the institutional memory of the Briggs Hartley in a way that occasionally served the operation and more occasionally impeded it. Looked at her with the assessment of someone recalibrating. "Supply manager," he said. "That's right. We had a cook. He left." "I know," she said. "I'm not a cook. I manage the provisions operation for the whole ranch. Kitchen, supplies, feed procurement, winter planning. I also cook because somebody has to, and I'm good at it." A pause. "Colton hire you," he said. "He did. The paperwork's in the main house if you'd like to review it." She said this without heat, not sarcastic, just informational. "I'll be serving the first full supper tonight at 6. I'd recommend being there because the food is going to be significantly better than what you've been eating." She picked up her trowel and went back to the herb bed. She heard the younger one say something she couldn't quite catch, and Deke make a non-committal sound, and then their boots moved away across the yard. She exhaled slowly through her nose and kept weeding. It was going to be like this for a while. She'd known it would be. Knowing it didn't make it easier, but it did mean she wasn't surprised by it. And in her experience, surprise was the thing that made difficult situations worse. Jed Marsh, the foreman, was a different kind of problem, and also, she suspected, a more important one. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who moved through the ranch with the ease of someone who'd been doing this work for 30 years and didn't need to think about most of it. His wife, a quiet woman named Clara, had been ill with a persistent lung complaint for the past 2 years. Not dangerously ill, but ill enough to require Jed's attention at home in ways that had pulled him away from the ranch's operational details. This was the source of most of what had drifted. He was polite to Hazel when Colton introduced them properly that first afternoon. Not warm, but polite in the specific way of a man who was reserving judgment. She respected that more than false welcome. "I understand you'll be coordinating with me on the feed procurement," he said. "On the timing and volume, yes," she said. "You know the herd and its needs better than I do. I need that information to make the purchasing decisions land at the right time." He considered this. "You know feed supply?" "I know supply management," she said. "The specifics of feed I'll learn from you if you're willing to teach me. The planning and procurement end I'll handle." He looked at her steadily. "You've done ranch supply before?" "No. I've managed a boarding house operation for 6 years and kept it solvent through 3 bad trade seasons." "The principles are the same. Cattle aren't travelers," he said. "No, but winter is winter and a shortage is a shortage." She paused. "I'm not trying to do your job, Mr. Marsh. I'm trying to do mine, and mine overlaps with yours in specific places. I'm suggesting we figure out where those places are so we don't trip over each other." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Come by the barn after supper. I'll show you the feed records." "Thank you," she said. It was an acceptance, but it was a door left slightly open, and that was enough for now. The first supper at the Briggs Hartley was not a triumph. She'd known going in that it wouldn't be. She was working with a poorly stocked kitchen, equipment she hadn't fully calibrated yet, and a stove with the flu issue that she'd mentally flagged but hadn't had time to address. What she served was solid and considerably better than what the hands had been eating, but it was not her best work and she knew it, and it bothered her more than she would have admitted. She made a stewed beef with root vegetables that cleaned out some of the older pantry stock, cornbread, always cornbread, because she could make cornbread work under almost any conditions, and a dried apple compote she threw together in the last 20 minutes because the meal needed something to finish it, and she had the apples and the time. 8 men sat at the long table in the cook shed. Colton ate with his hands, which she'd already noted as a characteristic of the operation. The owner didn't separate himself from the workers at mealtimes, which said something she approved of. Deke was there, watchful. The young hand, whose name turned out to be Emmett, and who was 19 and from Missouri, and seemed to have decided that reserve was the correct initial posture, sat at the far end and ate without comment. Rowley Fitch, the old man Colton had described as likely to die on the property, sat directly across from Hazel's serving station and watched her work with the candid observation of someone who had been alive long enough to consider social discretion optional. "You make this stew?" he said. "I did." "Better than what Aldous made," he said. Aldous had apparently been the previous cook. "He always overcooked the vegetables until they were mush." "They should have some resistance," she said. "They're not ornamental." Rowley made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been digestion. It was hard to tell with him. Nobody said anything about the quality of the food being good, but nobody left anything on their plates, which in her professional experience was often a more reliable indicator. After supper, she went to the barn and spent an hour with Jed Marsh going over the feed records. They were in worse shape than she'd expected. Not inaccurate, but inconsistent, with gaps that reflected the periods when Jed had been distracted by Clara's illness. She didn't remark on the gaps. She just noted them and worked out what information she'd need to fill them in. "When do you typically start seeing the winter pressure on the herd?" she asked. "Usually by the 2nd week of November," he said, though last year it came early, end of October. "So you need full winter supply in place by October 15th at the latest." "That's about right." Current stock will cover maybe 3 weeks at your current head count, she said, looking at her calculations. You need to be purchasing by mid-August. He looked at her numbers. That's earlier than we've done it. That's why you've been running short, she said, without inflection. Just a statement of causality. He was quiet for a moment. She let him be quiet. She'd learned early in her working life that some people needed time to accept accurate information, and pushing them toward it faster than they were ready to move generally made them dig in rather than arrive. I'll get you the full head count numbers tomorrow, he said finally, and the grazing rotation schedule. That would help, she said. Thank you, Mr. Marsh. She walked back to the main house in the dark, and through the kitchen window she could see the warm light inside, and the shape of the place that was now, for the foreseeable future, her life. She went inside and got to work on tomorrow's breakfast prep. The challenge arrived at the end of her second week, the way challenges on a ranch tend to arrive. Not by appointment, not with warning, just suddenly present and requiring management. It came in the form of a man named Garth Puller. Puller was one of the 8 full-time hands, a big man of about 35 who had been on the Briggs-Hartley for 4 years and had apparently spent a portion of that time developing the opinion that he was underutilized and undervalued, which may have been true in some respects and was definitely overcompensated for in others. He was skilled with cattle. She'd heard Jed say so without enthusiasm, which meant it was genuinely true. And he was the kind of man who used competence in one area as a credential for authority in all others. He'd been making small things difficult since she arrived. Not overtly, nothing she could point to directly, but in the particular friction of someone who doesn't cooperate with a new authority and doesn't quite refuse either. He was late to meals. He made comments about the food at a volume designed to be heard without being directly addressed. He went to Jed Marsh with supply questions instead of to Hazel, which was technically Jed's purview for the feed side, but which felt like a deliberate routing around her for everything else. She let it go for 2 weeks. This was a calculated choice, not passivity. She needed to understand the full shape of the resistance before she responded to it, and she needed the other hands to see that she could do the work before she made any direct confrontations that might require them to choose sides. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the kitchen completely. The pantry was ordered by use frequency and shelf life, with a running inventory on a chalkboard by the door that she updated every other day. The cook shed was clean in a way it evidently hadn't been in some time. Emmett had actually helped her scrub the walls one afternoon without being asked, which she noted as a data point about his character. She'd fixed the stove flue herself, with a consultation from Rowley Fitch, who'd been watching her try to figure it out from a safe distance and had finally walked over and told her which piece needed bending. The food had gotten progressively better as she got familiar with the equipment and restocked the pantry with the right things. She'd ridden into the nearest supply town, a place called Harker's Mill, 15 miles east, twice in the past 2 weeks, each time with a list she'd calculated to the specific item. She'd established accounts with 2 merchants there, negotiated payment terms, and arranged a regular delivery schedule that would cut her riding time in half once it was established. The hands ate better. This was a fact that was hard to argue with, even for people inclined to argue with it. Puller made his move on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the supply room doing the weekly count when she heard him in the kitchen, and then he appeared in the doorway of the supply room without knocking. The room had no door, but there was a courtesy around the threshold she'd made clear, and that everyone except Puller observed. "Need to talk about the supper schedule," he said. She didn't look up from her count. "What about it?" "The hands who do the late evening check on the herd aren't getting back until close to 8, he said. "Supper at 6 doesn't work for them." This was partially true. There were 2 hands who rotated evening herd duty and did come in late. She'd already been keeping food warm for them, which she'd arranged without a policy conversation because it seemed like the obvious solution. "I keep a covered plate for each of the evening duty hands," she said. "Both of them know to come get it when they're back. This isn't a new problem." "Still doesn't work," he said. "Warm over food isn't the same as fresh." She set down her pencil and looked at him. "You're right," she said. "Warm over food isn't the same. But serving supper at 8 to accommodate 2 hands means the other 6 eat late, which means the kitchen stays hot through the evening and cuts into the prep time I need for the next morning's breakfast. I don't have the staff to run 2 service times." "So get more staff," he said. That's Colton's decision, not mine to make unilaterally, she said. If you think we need another kitchen hand, you're welcome to bring that to Colton. That's how decisions like that get made here. He looked at her with a kind of flat assessment, like he was evaluating whether the angle he'd chosen was working and deciding to try another one. Look, he said, with the manufactured reasonableness that she immediately recognized as the version of this conversation that was supposed to seem fair. We've been running this ranch for years before you got here. The way things were done worked. The way things were done left you short on winter feed twice, she said. And the kitchen was under-provisioned, and the pantry had 3 kinds of dried beans and no cornmeal, and the stove flue hadn't been cleaned in what looked like 2 seasons. I'm not here to tell anyone they did bad work. I'm here to make things run better. That's what Colton hired me for. Colton hired you to cook, Puller said. Colton hired me to manage supply and provisions, she said, which includes the cooking, but is considerably more than it. That's a big claim for someone who's been here 2 weeks. She looked at him steadily. She wasn't angry, or rather, she was angry, but the anger was below the surface, controlled, a tool rather than a reaction. The chalkboard in the kitchen, she said, the inventory system, the supply accounts in Harker's mill, the feed procurement timeline I've worked out with Mr. Marsh, the stove that drafts correctly now. She paused. That's 2 weeks of work. You're welcome to tell me what the previous 2 weeks produced. Puller's jaw tightened. I'm not the one you need to convince, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm not wasting more time on this conversation. She picked up her pencil and went back to her count. He stood in the doorway for another moment. She could feel it. And then she heard his boots on the floorboards and he was gone. She finished the count. She wrote the numbers in the column. Her handwriting was even. Well, the accident happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she'd arrived. She was at the herb bed in the early morning. It had come back considerably with some attention, and she'd gotten mint and thyme and rosemary to a point where she could actually use them, when she heard it. A shout from the direction of the north pasture, then the quality of sound that preceded bad news. She got there before Jed Marsh did. Rowley Fitch was on the ground near the fence line, his face gray-white and set in the particular expression of a man who was absorbing pain and trying not to show how much. His right arm was wrong. She could see that from 10 feet away, the angle of it against his body. He'd been repairing the fence post. She saw the tools scattered around him, and either the post had shifted or he'd lost his footing on the rough ground and come down on the arm hard. Don't move it, she said immediately, crouching beside him. Wasn't planning to, he said through clenched teeth. She looked at the arm carefully, not touching it yet. The break appeared to be in the forearm. She couldn't tell yet if it was a clean break or a compound fracture, which was the more urgent question. She ran through what she knew, which was the result of practical necessity over years rather than any formal training. Her father had broken his collarbone when she was 11, and the nearest doctor had been half a day's ride, and the only way he'd made it through the wait without the break worsening from movement was careful immobilization. What's your pain level? She said. On a plain scale, bad, very bad, or can't think straight. Very bad, he said, heading toward the third. Can you feel your fingers? A pause. Yes. Good. Not a nerve issue, or at least not a severe one. I need to immobilize the arm before we move you, she said. I'm going to do that now. Tell me if anything I do makes the pain spike sharply. Not worse, but sharply different. All right, he said. She used the tools available. 2 straight sections of fence board that were narrow enough, and strips torn from her apron, which was heavy cotton and held the binding well. She'd never formally splinted an arm before, but she understood the principle. Immobilize the joints above and below the break, keep the limb level with the body, don't apply pressure to the break site itself. She worked carefully and quickly, and Rowley made controlled sounds and didn't move. By the time Jed arrived, she had the arm secured. Jed looked at the splint, then at Hazel. Doctor's in Harker's mill, he said. I know. We need to get him there without jostling that arm. Wagon, not horse. I'll get it. While Jed went for the wagon, Rowley looked at her from the ground with that candid, unsentimental gaze of his. Where'd you learn that? He said. My father, she said. When I was 11. Did his break heal right? Mostly, she said. He complained about it in cold weather for the rest of his life. Rowley made a sound that was, she thought, an actual laugh underneath the pain. Not much of a recommendation, he said. He made it to the doctor with the break intact, she said. That's what I'm aiming for. The wagon came and they got him onto it as carefully as 8 combined hands could manage, and Jed drove for Harker's Mill at a pace that balanced urgency and smoothness, and 3 of the hands rode alongside. Hazel watched them go from the edge of the yard. Then she went back to the kitchen to start the midday meal, because there were still 6 hands on the property who needed to eat, and the fact that something difficult had just happened was not, in her experience, an argument against the continuation of ordinary work. Oh, Raleigh Fitch came back from Harker's Mill that evening with his arm properly set and splinted, and the doctor's confirmation that the break had been clean and the immobilization before transport had been exactly right. He said this in the main house with Colton and Jed Marsh present, and he said it in the particular way of a man who was making a point of saying something, not just reporting information. She knew what she was doing, Rowley said, quick and calm, and she didn't make me feel like an inconvenience about it. Colton looked at Hazel across the room. She was in the kitchen doorway where she'd come to hear the report. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked away, back at the kitchen, because there was still the evening cleanup to finish. At supper that night, something had shifted in the room. She could feel it, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to specifically, but in the texture of how the hands moved around her, how they passed dishes, how Emmett said thank you when she refilled his coffee in a way he hadn't said it before. Even Deke Sandoval, who had maintained a careful neutrality for 3 weeks, looked at her while she was clearing plates and said, "Good supper," with the brevity of a man who didn't give compliments easily. She said, "Thank you," and kept clearing. It was not a transformation. The ranch didn't suddenly reorganize itself around her presence, or decide collectively that all doubts had been resolved. Puller was still Puller, still arriving marginally late to meals, still angling toward a conflict she could feel building at a low frequency beneath the surface of the daily work. But the room felt different. She sat in her room that night with her notebook open, doing the calculations for the August feed order, and she let herself acknowledge, quietly, without making a production of it, that 3 weeks in, she was still here. She hadn't been driven back to Dry Creek Crossing. The work was hard, and the resistance was real, and she'd made 3 mistakes in the kitchen that she was still calibrating from, but she was still here. That was not a small thing. Outside her south-facing window, the territory was dark and vast, and completely indifferent to what she thought about it, which was oddly comforting. The land didn't have an opinion about her. It just existed, requiring management and attention and the kind of patient work that she was, as it turned out, well-suited to provide. She finished the feed order calculations. She closed the notebook. She lay in the bed that was now her bed, in the room that was now her room, in a place that was still making up its mind about her, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, think that this might actually work. Not because it was going smoothly, it wasn't going smoothly, but she was still here and the work was real, and that was the only foundation that had ever held anything up. The feed order she'd calculated in early August went through without incident, which meant it didn't go through without argument. Jed Marsh had looked at the numbers she'd put together. The volume, the timing, the cost projection against the previous 2 years' emergency purchases. And he'd been quiet for a long time before he said, "That's more than we've ever ordered at one time. It's less than you've spent in total each winter once you account for the emergency pricing," she said. She had the comparison written out, column by column, on the back page of her notebook. She'd prepared it specifically for this conversation. "You're spending the same money. You're just spending it before the need arrives instead of after." Jed had looked at the columns for a long time. "I'll need to run this by Colton," he said. "I already did," she said. "He approved it last Thursday." Another silence. "You went to Colton before you came to me with this." She heard what he was really saying. The question of whether she'd gone around him, whether she'd used her direct access to Colton to shortcut the foreman's authority. She'd thought about how to handle this exact tension before she'd had either conversation, and she'd decided that full transparency was the only approach that didn't create a larger problem down the road. "I went to Colton to confirm that the budget would support the order," she said. "That's a financial decision, not an operational one. I came to you with the operational specifics because that's your area. I wasn't trying to step around you, Mr. Marsh. I was trying to get the decisions made in the right order." He looked at her. "The right order being your order?" he said. "The right order being financial authorization before operational planning," she said, because it seemed unkind to plan the whole thing and then find out the budget didn't support it. It was the closest she'd come to direct conflict with Jed Marsh. And she held the line without escalating it, because she'd learned over the past 2 months that Jed was a man who responded to consistency and didn't respond well to being pressured. He needed to arrive at his conclusions himself. You could put the information in front of him, but you couldn't drag him to it. He approved the order 2 days later and told her she'd done the math correctly, which from Jed Marsh was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. So, by September, the Briggs Hartley had changed in ways that were visible if you knew what you were looking at. The kitchen ran on a real schedule now. Breakfast at 5:45 for the early hands, the main breakfast service at 6:30, midday meal packed and delivered to the field crews at 11:30, supper at 6 with late plates held for the evening duty rotation. The pantry was never below the baseline she'd established. The supply accounts in Harker's Mill had been renegotiated twice, with better terms each time as she demonstrated reliable volume and payment. The herb bed had become a working garden, producing enough that she'd begun drying and storing in quantity for the winter. The hands ate better. They also, as she'd predicted to Colton, worked better. Nothing dramatic, just the aggregate difference between men who were fed adequately and men who were fed well, which added up over a season into fewer errors, better mood, less turnover, and the small frictions of daily ranch work. Colton noticed. He didn't make speeches about it. He was not a man who made speeches, but she'd catch him sometimes looking at the operation with a different quality of attention, the look of a man who sees his property running the way he'd always thought it could and wasn't quite used to it yet. They developed an easy working relationship that she valued specifically because it was professional first. He told her what the ranch needed, and she told him how to get it. They argued sometimes, not often, but when their views differed, they said so directly, which she found more respectful than the alternative. He had a tendency to underestimate logistics timelines, which came from being primarily a cattleman who thought in seasons rather than in weeks. She had a tendency to overplan for contingencies, which came from years of managing resources in a place where failure had real consequences. They balanced each other out in this respect in a way that neither of them commented on directly. She was careful about the other thing, the thing that wasn't professional. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound at the edge of hearing, present, not confirmed, easily dismissed if you decided to dismiss it. She decided to dismiss it and focus on the work, because the work was the thing she'd come here for and the thing that actually held. The first sign of real trouble came from outside the ranch, which was how the worst trouble usually arrived. Not from within the thing you were building, but from someone watching you build it. His name was Warren Lyle. She heard the name first from Rowley Fitch, who mentioned it in passing one evening in October while she was treating his arm, which had healed well but stiffened in the cooling weather and required occasional attention to keep the range of motion from reducing further. "Lyle was in Harker's Mill last week," Rowley said, asking about the ranch. Hazel worked the joint carefully, the way the doctor in Harker's Mill had shown her. "What kind of asking?" "The kind that isn't really asking," Rowley said. "The kind that's telling you what it thinks." She knew the kind. "What does Lyle want with this place?" "What he wants with all the places," Rowley said. "He's been buying up water rights between here and the Garrison Road for 2 years. This ranch has the only significant creek access in a 20-mile radius that he doesn't control yet." Hazel filed this and told Colton that evening. He already knew, which was partly a relief and partly its own concern. Known problems that weren't being actively addressed had a way of becoming urgent at the worst possible moment. "Lyle's approached me twice," Colton said. They were in the main house, at the table where they often had these end-of-day operational conversations. "Both times with an offer to buy the water rights outright. Both times I told him they weren't for sale. And now he's making inquiries in town," she said. "That's what people like Lyle do when they can't buy something directly," he said. "They find another angle." "What's his legal position?" Colton was quiet for a moment. "That's the part I'm less certain about. The water rights documentation in this territory it's a mess. A lot of the original claims were filed before the current land office procedures, and the records have gaps." She understood immediately what that meant. "He's looking for a gap," she said. "That's my concern." "Do you have documentation of the original claim?" "My father filed it. I have some of what he left me, but I don't know if it's complete." "Where's the rest?" He spread his hand slightly. "That's what I don't know." She looked at him across the table. This was a larger problem than she'd initially assessed, and she could see from his expression that he knew it too. I want to look at what you have, she said. All of it. Whatever documentation exists. It's the ranch's water, she said, and the ranch's water is how we get through winter and spring. If Lyle finds a legal argument for disputing the claim, the feed order I put in becomes irrelevant because we won't have a functioning operation to feed. She held his gaze. Let me look at what you have. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him work through whatever reservation he'd been holding. The habit of keeping certain parts of the ranch's business separate from the operational side, maybe. Or just the particular difficulty of admitting that a problem was larger than you wanted it to be. Come to the office tomorrow morning, he said. I'll pull everything. Post. The files were a mess, which she'd half expected, not a careless mess. The original documents were preserved with care, wrapped in oilcloth, stored in a locked chest. But they were the accumulated records of 2 generations of a ranch operation, covering 40 years of land filings, water claims, boundary adjustments, easement agreements, and the routine paperwork of a working property. Nobody had organized them into a logical system because nobody had needed to, until now, when specific documentation needed to be found quickly. She spent 2 days going through them with Colton, sorting and cataloging. She'd done this kind of work before, in a less formal way. Managing aldermen's accounts had required her to reconstruct records more than once when Clarence's filing system proved to be primarily decorative. She had a systematic mind for it. Find the oldest documents first, establish the foundational claims, work forward. What she found was mostly good, and partly not good, and entirely complicated. The water rights claim was original and legitimate. She could see that in the founding documents. Colton's father had filed correctly under the provisions of the time. But there was a boundary amendment from about 15 years ago that had been improperly witnessed. She could see the signature was missing from one of the required lines, and this was likely the gap that Lyle's people had found or were looking for. This needs to be corrected formally, she said. An amended filing with the land office with proper witnesses, before Lyle has a chance to use it. Can we correct it retroactively? I don't know the specific territorial law, she said. We need a lawyer. He nodded slowly. The nearest land attorney is in Caldwell, 3 days' ride. Then we go to Caldwell. He looked at her. You'll need someone who understands the documentation to explain the filing history, she said. I've spent 2 days learning it. That's the practical reason. She held his gaze. And this affects the whole operation, which means it affects me, which means I have a stake in getting it right. He considered this for a moment and then said, We'll leave Friday morning. Blumped. What happened before Friday was the other attack, which came on a different front entirely, and was in some ways worse because it was harder to document. The rumors reached her through Emmett, who was young enough to feel guilty about information, and told her about it with the awkward directness of someone who'd decided that withholding it was worse than saying it. People in Harker's Mill are saying things, he said. He was at the kitchen table, technically waiting for his supper, but obviously there for a different reason. About you. She set the lid back on the pot and looked at him. What kind of things? He had the decency to look uncomfortable. That you came here for reasons that aren't professional. That you had a history in Dry Creek Crossing that... He stopped. That you're here because of Colton personally, and the supply work is just a cover for it. Hazel absorbed this. She'd been prepared for a version of it, the way you prepare for weather you can see building on the horizon, intellectually ready, but the actual arrival still lands with weight. The specific cruelty of it was the implication that a woman who looked like her couldn't possibly have been hired for her actual abilities, that the only coherent explanation for her presence here was something improper, that her competence was inherently less believable than the alternative story. Who's saying it? She asked. There's a man named Prentice who's been in the mill twice in the last month asking about the ranch. He's connected to Lyle. Of course he was. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, Thank you for telling me, Emmett. He nodded, miserable. I thought you should know. I should. You did the right thing. She turned back to the stove. Supper's in 10 minutes. She told Colton that night. She told him plainly, without the particular kind of careful framing she might have used with someone else. The hedging, the softening. She told him because he needed to know, and because she'd decided early in her time here that partial information was its own kind of dishonesty. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Prentice is Lyle's man in Harker's Mill. He's been there for about a year feeding information back. So this is coordinated, she said. The legal challenge and the reputation attack. Two angles at once. Lyle is not a subtle man, Colton said, but he's not a stupid one. I want to address it directly, she said. The rumors. I'm not going to let them sit unanswered. He looked at her. How? I'm going to go to Harker's Mill and talk to the merchants I work with, she said. Not to defend myself. I'm not going to stand in the street and make a case for my own character. But I've built working relationships there over the past months, and those relationships are based on actual work. I'm going to let that work speak instead of the rumors. And if it doesn't resolve it, then it doesn't, she said. But I'm not going to let someone else's story about me be the only story available. He was quiet for a moment. I could say something publicly, he said. Make the position clear. I know, she said, and I might need you to. But I want to try the other way first. She met his eyes. I've spent a long time letting other people decide what I was. I'm not doing that anymore. Something moved across his expression. Not pity. She would have objected to pity. Something closer to respect, which she could accept. Then we do it your way first, he said. Well, the trip to Harker's Mill was its own kind of work. She went on a Wednesday, on one of the ranch horses, with the supply list for the week's provisions as her stated purpose. She went to the feed merchant first, a man named Buford Cole, who had been skeptical of her on the first visit, gradually professional by the third, and by the sixth was treating her with the particular respect merchants give to customers who pay on time and order intelligently. She didn't bring up the rumors directly. She conducted her business, placed her orders, discussed the winter pricing she'd heard was coming and what it would mean for her procurement schedule. She asked Cole about the road conditions to the north. She asked him about a piece of equipment she'd seen advertised that she was considering for the kitchen. At the end of the conversation, Cole said, "There's been some talk." "I've heard," she said. "I want you to know I don't put stock in it," he said. He said it the way a man says something he's decided to say and is slightly uncomfortable about saying. The Briggs-Hartley account has been one of my most organized since you started managing it, whatever else people want to say. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate you saying that." She moved through the mill the same way at the other accounts. Present, professional, doing the work. Not performing anything. Just being the person she actually was in each of those relationships, which was competent and fair and reliable, and letting that be visible. When she encountered Prentice himself, she recognized him from Emmett's description, a thin man with a watchful quality who was standing near the general store when she came out. She looked at him directly and said nothing, which was sometimes more effective than words. He looked away first. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, tired from the day but with something settled in her chest that hadn't been settled before. She'd done what she could do. The rest was outside her control, and she'd made a specific decision some time ago to stop exhausting herself on the things outside her control. The wildfire came on a Friday in late October, which was not when fires usually came, but fires didn't consult the calendar. It started to the northeast, which was the direction the wind had been building from all morning. She'd noticed it in the way she noticed weather now, as a practical consideration rather than an aesthetic one. By midday, the smoke was visible, a brown column rising against the pale sky. By 2 o'clock, it was clear the fire was moving toward them. Colton was out with Jed and 3 hands moving the herd to the south pasture, which was the right instinct. Get the cattle away from the fire's path. That left 6 people on the ranch property: Hazel, Emmett, Rowley Fitch, who couldn't ride hard with his arm still recovering, the foreman's wife Clara, who had come to the ranch for the week, a hand named Pico, who'd twisted his knee 2 days earlier, and a young girl named Sepha, who came in twice a week to help in the kitchen. Hazel assessed the situation in about 90 seconds. The fire was moving fast. The main house was defensible if they cleared the immediate perimeter. Dry grass and debris close to the structures was the primary risk. The water supply from the creek was adequate for firefighting if they moved quickly. The livestock in the barn needed to be moved to the south corral, away from the structures. "Emmett," she said, "get the horses out of the barn to the south corral. Every horse now. Pico, you're on the water line. I need the hand pump primed and the troughs on the north side filled. Clara, I need everything combustible moved away from the kitchen wall. The wood pile, the dry grass along the fence, All of it. You can't fight a prairie fire, Pico said. We're not fighting it, she said. We're making sure it has nothing to eat when it gets here. There's a difference. She put Rowley on the well pump. His arm would complain, but he could manage it. And she and Cepha went at the north perimeter with rakes and bare hands, clearing the accumulated dry material away from the buildings in a fire break that wasn't elegant, but was real. The next 2 hours were the kind of hours that don't leave you the way ordinary hours leave you. She worked without stopping and didn't allow herself to think about anything except the next specific task, because there were too many tasks and not enough people, and the smoke was thickening in the north, and every time she let herself look up at it, she felt the pull of a fear she couldn't afford. Emmett came back from the south corral, and she put him on the barn roof with wet burlap. The sparks were the risk now. The fire's advance scouts, landing on dry wood and catching before you saw them. She stayed on the ground and directed and worked and called out when she saw something, and the group of 6 people operated. Not smoothly, but continuously, the way people operate when the alternative is losing everything. When Colton and Jed came back in the late afternoon with the hands, the fire had passed to the south of them. The open pasture land had given it easier fuel, and it had moved on. The main house was standing. The barn was standing. The kitchen building had a scorched section of wall along the north side where an ember had caught briefly before Emmett got to it, but the structure was intact. Colton walked through the property with the expression of a man who was counting what he still had rather than what he'd lost. He came to Hazel, who was sitting on the back step of the kitchen with water she was actually drinking this time, her hands dirty and her lungs still tasting of smoke. He looked at the cleared perimeter, the wet burlap on the barn roof, the fire break she'd made along the north fence. You organized this, he said. There were 6 of us, she said. Everyone did the work. You organized it, he said again. Not a question. She looked at her hands. There was a clear sequence of priorities. Anyone could have identified them. Nobody else did, he said. She was too tired for false modesty and too honest for performance. No, she said. Nobody else did. He sat down beside her on the step, which surprised her. He didn't sit on the step. He was a stand-up man by default. She'd rarely seen him sit anywhere that wasn't a chair at a table. They sat there for a while in the smoky late afternoon air, looking at the property that was still standing, and she was aware of him beside her in the specific way she'd been careful about for months. The awareness that she'd been disciplined enough to keep at a distance. She was tired, and the ranch was standing, and 6 months ago she'd been invisible in a boarding house and calling it a life. Colton, she said. He looked at her. When we go to Caldwell, she said, for the lawyer. Yes. I want to be in the room, she said, not waiting outside, not briefing you beforehand and letting you handle it. In the room, at the table, contributing to the conversation. He looked at her for a moment. I was assuming you would be, he said. She nodded. She hadn't been certain of that, and she'd needed to be certain. All right, she said. They rode to Caldwell the following week. The lawyer, a precise man named Adler, who had been practicing land law in the territory for 30 years, reviewed the documentation she'd organized and cataloged, and identified the same gap she'd found. The improperly witnessed boundary amendment. He confirmed that it could be corrected through a formal amended filing with additional supporting documentation, and that if the correction was made before Lyle filed a formal challenge, the claim would be substantially harder to attack. How long have we got? Colton asked. Lyle's man has been making inquiries for 6 weeks, Adler said, looking at his own notes. My estimate is he files within the month. You have perhaps 3 weeks to get the corrected documentation in order and filed. What do we need? Hazel asked. Adler looked at her, slightly surprised by the directness. She was used to that reaction from men in professional settings, and it no longer threw her. She held his gaze. He told her what they needed: 2 current witnesses of standing, the supporting land survey from the original claim period, and a deposition from anyone with direct knowledge of the original filing. Colton's foreman, Jed Marsh, had been on the ranch when the boundary amendment was made. Rowley Fitch had been there even longer. Rowley was here when the original claim was filed, Colton said. He was 18 years old. He remembers everything about this ranch from the beginning. Then get his deposition in writing, Adler said. That's your strongest piece. They left Caldwell with a clear list of what was needed and 17 days to do it. On the ride back, Hazel went over the list in her head the way she went over supply lists, item by item, sequence of action, dependencies, timeline. It was manageable, tight, but manageable. "We can do this," she said. Colton rode beside her in the fading afternoon light, and she could see him running his own calculations, and after a moment he said, "Yes, we can." Not I. They'd both noticed that. We. She didn't remark on it. Neither did he. They rode back to the ranch in the growing dark, and behind them the territory went on in all its enormous indifference. And ahead of them the work was still waiting, the way work always waited. Patient, specific, and entirely real. The 17 days moved the way high-stakes time always moves. Too fast in the moments that needed care, and too slow in the gaps between, when there was nothing to do but wait, and the waiting had its own particular weight. Rowley Fitch gave his deposition on the second day back from Caldwell, sitting at the kitchen table with Adler's written questions in front of him, and Hazel across from him taking notes in her careful hand. He was 81 years old and remembered the original water rights filing with a clarity that surprised even Colton. The date, the land office clerk's name, the fact that it had rained the morning they rode in to file and his horse had thrown a shoe on the way back. Memory worked that way sometimes, holding on to the peripheral details of important days more reliably than the central ones. She wrote everything down. She wrote it down twice, once in her notebook, once on the formal document paper Adler had sent back with them. "You'll need to sign each page," she told Rowley when they were done. "My hand's not what it was," he said. His right arm had healed, but the grip strength had not fully returned, and he was still adjusting to doing things with a hand that no longer responded the way he expected. "I'll guide it if you need," she said. Not as charity, as practical information. He looked at her steadily with those direct old eyes of his. "All right," he said. They got through the signature pages slowly, his hand and hers together on the pen, and she kept her attention on the paper and not on his face, because she knew he'd find witnessed effort more dignified than witnessed emotion. When it was done, he sat back and said, "This ranch was a good place when it started. It was starting to not be before you came." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without ornamentation. She didn't say anything immediately, because she didn't trust what would come out. She capped her pen and organized the pages. "Thank you for this," she said finally. "This is what saves the water claim." "I know," he said. "That's why I did it." The corrected filing reached the Caldwell Land Office with 4 days to spare. Adler sent word by courier, a short note in his precise handwriting confirming that the amended documentation had been accepted and recorded, that the original claim was now fully supported, and that any challenge Lyle filed would be met with a complete and properly documented counterposition. Colton read the note at the breakfast table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and drank his coffee and didn't say much, which was how he processed things that mattered. That evening, Hazel found him at the fence line on the north pasture, looking out at the land in the particular way he looked at it when he was thinking rather than assessing. She came and stood beside him with her own coffee, and they looked at the property together in the early dark. "Lyle's not done," he said. "He'll find another approach." "Probably," she said, "but this particular approach is closed, and each time he's blocked it costs him something. Time, money, credibility with the people who might otherwise have supported him." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about him strategically." "Someone had to," she said. Another silence, comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable over months of working alongside each other. "Hazel," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, not at her, which she'd come to understand was how he handled the things that were hardest for him to say directly. He looked at the thing in front of him and said the thing sideways, and it was its own kind of honesty. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a real question before you answer it, not something you feel you have to respond to a certain way because of the work situation." She waited. "I don't want you to stay here as an employee," he said. "I want you to stay here as a partner, in the ranch, in the rest of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not good at this particular kind of talking, but I want to say it clearly enough that you understand what I mean." She did understand what he meant. She'd known it was building for months. She'd have been dishonest with herself to pretend otherwise. The shape of it had been there in the small, consistent things. The way he made sure she was in the room for every important conversation. The way he'd started framing ranch decisions as we, without seeming to notice. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, which she always was. She looked at the north pasture too, at the dark land under the dark sky, and thought about what she wanted to say and how to say it in a way that was true. "I need to tell you something first," she said, "not as a barrier, as information." He turned slightly toward her. "I came here from a situation that ended badly," she said. "Not violently. Nothing like that. But I made a choice based on what I believed about a person, and that person was not who I thought, and I spent 6 years in Dry Creek Crossing working out the cost of that mistake." She paused. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it's the reason I'm careful. And I'm going to be careful about this, which means I'm going to need things to be clear and real and not just implied." "That's fair," he said. "What does clear and real look like to you?" "It looks like equal," she said. "Not you being generous to me, not me being grateful. Equal. My voice carries the same weight in this operation. My decisions get the same consideration. We disagree and we say so and we work it out, and neither of us uses the other's position against them." She looked at him now directly. "I've spent most of my life being treated like someone whose usefulness was conditional on her staying small. I'm not willing to accept that anymore, even from someone who means well." He held her gaze without flinching. "I know what I'm getting in you," he said. "I've watched you work for 8 months. Equal is not a compromise for me. It's what I'm asking for. I don't need someone who disappears into this ranch. I need someone who argues with me when I'm wrong and makes the decision she's qualified to make and doesn't wait for permission to be the person she is." She was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be wrong fairly often," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm counting on you to tell me." The corner of her mouth moved. "All right," she said. He reached out and she took his hand, and they stood at the fence line as the dark settled fully over the north pasture. And it was not a dramatic moment. It was not a perfect moment. It was just two people who had been careful for a long time deciding together to be slightly less careful, which was its own quiet kind of courage. Puller left in November. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't a firing exactly. It was the slow conclusion of a situation that had been building since Hazel's first week on the ranch. He'd found fewer and fewer purchase points for his particular brand of resistance as the months went on, partly because the other hands had stopped being available as an audience for it, and partly because the working conditions he'd been implicitly threatening to leave over were, objectively, better than they'd been before. What finally resolved it was a conversation between Puller and Colton that Hazel was not present for, and she deliberately didn't ask about the specifics, because it was Colton's conversation to have, and her asking for a full account of it would have been its own kind of undermining. What she learned from Emmett, who had a limited capacity for not sharing what he knew, was that Colton had made the working arrangement clear, and Puller had decided clarity was not what he wanted. He collected his final pay on a Thursday and rode out Friday morning. Deke Sandoval watched him go from the barn door with the expression of a man completing a calculation he'd been running for some time. "Good riddance," Deke said, to nobody in particular, which from Deke Sandoval was approximately equivalent to a formal statement of position. They hired a new hand named Reese in December, a quiet woman of about 30 from somewhere in the Eastern Territory who came with a reference from a ranch near Harker's Mill and who had a way with horses that Jed Marsh approved of in the wordless way Jed approved of things. Her arrival changed the texture of the bunkhouse in small ways that Hazel noticed and was glad of. They married in February at the ranch, with Jed Marsh and his wife Clara as witnesses and Rowley Fitch sitting in the kitchen chair that someone had carried outside for him because he was not going to miss it and also was not going to stand for it. Emmett had cleaned his boots twice for the occasion, which she noticed and found unexpectedly moving. Adler, the lawyer, sent a note of congratulations from Caldwell that was formal and warm in equal measure. It was not a large ceremony. It was not an elaborate one. The territory's justice of the peace came out from Harker's Mill, and they stood in the yard in the cold February air and said what needed to be said, and it was done. Afterward, Hazel stood in the kitchen making the wedding supper herself, because nobody else was going to do it right, and also because she genuinely wanted to, not out of obligation, but because cooking for people she cared about was one of the things she'd always done with her better feelings when she had them, and she had them today. Raleigh appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was working. "You want company?" he said. "If you're not going to tell me how my mother would have done it differently." "I never met your mother," he said. "Then sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her work, and they talked about nothing consequential for a while. The price of spring feed, whether the north pasture fence was going to need full replacement or could manage with patching, the quality of the flour she'd gotten from the new mill in Harker's Mill compared to the old supplier. The ordinary conversation of a working day, running through the middle of an extraordinary one. Warren Lyle made his legal challenge in March, as Adler had predicted he would. He'd found a different angle than the water rights gap. The corrected filing had closed that, and instead attacked the survey boundaries on the eastern parcels, arguing a discrepancy between the original filing coordinates and the actual fence lines. It was a thin argument, and Adler said so in terms that were legally measured but personally contemptuous. The documentation Hazel had organized and cataloged over the previous months made it possible to respond quickly and completely, with every relevant survey and filing date indexed and accessible. The challenge was dismissed by the territorial court in April. The dismissal included language from the presiding judge that was, Adler told them in a letter, unusually pointed in its characterization of Lyle's position as without merit. Lyle did not make a third attempt. What he did instead, and they heard this from Buford Cole in Harker's Mill, who heard it from a freight driver who'd come through from the north, was pivot his water rights acquisition to a different part of the territory, somewhere that didn't have someone working the documentation with the thoroughness that the Briggs-Hartley apparently had. Hazel filed this information in the part of her mind that tracked things she didn't need to act on but should remember, and went back to the spring supply orders. The ranch grew, not explosively. Nothing about Colton was explosive, and Hazel's approach to growth was the same as her approach to everything else, which was methodical and sequenced and based on what the foundation could actually support. But by the end of the first full year of the new management structure, they were running 400 head instead of 300, the supply operation was profitable rather than merely functional, and they'd hired 2 additional hands and a second kitchen worker, a broad-faced woman named Delphine, who turned out to have strong opinions about biscuit technique that led to a series of spirited conversations Hazel genuinely enjoyed. The garrison contract, the one that had been a small supplemental line, tripled in size when the garrison's quartermaster, a practical man who cared primarily about reliable supply and consistent quality, heard through the Harker's Mill network that the Briggs-Hartley was now the most organized operation in the region. Hazel negotiated the contract herself, which the quartermaster initially approached with the particular wariness men in procurement positions reserve for new suppliers. By the end of the second meeting, he was treating her the way he treated every supplier he'd decided was worth his time, directly, without ceremony, and with the respect of a professional for another professional. She'd earned it. That was the thing she'd stopped needing to remind herself of. She'd earned it, and earning it had come from doing the work. And doing the work was something she'd been capable of all along. The territory had just needed longer to figure that out than she had. What she thought about sometimes on the quiet evenings when the work was done and the ranch had settled into its end-of-day sounds was the woman she'd been on the back step of Alderman's boarding house in Dry Creek Crossing. Not with pity. She wasn't interested in pitying the younger version of herself. That woman had survived 6 years of a place that couldn't see her, had kept a kitchen running and a business functioning, and had fed children in the dark because it was the right thing to do and asked nothing for it. There was nothing pitiable about her. She'd been doing the work the whole time. She just hadn't been somewhere the work was visible. What she thought about, specifically, was what the 10-year-old boy Cal had asked on the back step the night before she left. "You scared?" "Yes. A little." And she'd gone anyway. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not the destination. The ranch was real, and the work was real, and the life she'd built here was real, but those outcomes weren't predictable from where she'd been standing on that back step. She hadn't known any of this was waiting. She'd known only that staying in a place that couldn't see her was a kind of slow disappearing, and she wasn't willing to finish the disappearing act. The courage wasn't in knowing it would work out. The courage was in leaving without knowing. She thought about the people she'd known who'd stayed in their own versions of Dry Creek Crossing. Not because they wanted to, but because the risk of leaving felt larger than the certainty of staying, and they'd mistaken certainty for safety. She understood the calculation. She'd run it herself for 6 years. What she'd eventually understood was that the certainty wasn't actually safety. It was just familiar damage, which was a different thing, and a worse one. In the spring of their second year at the ranch, a woman came through Harker's Mill on her way west. She'd heard, through the particular network by which women in difficult circumstances heard things, that the Briggs Hartley sometimes had work, and that it was a place that treated its people with ordinary decency. She showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, on foot, with a child on her hip and a canvas bag on her shoulder, and she stood at the main gate with the look of someone who had been refused enough times to have learned how to absorb refusal, but was trying one more time anyway. Hazel saw her from the kitchen window. She went out. The woman's name was Nora. She was 26, recently widowed, with a 2-year-old daughter named Bess and skills that ran to sewing and laundry and basic cooking and a willingness to do whatever work was available. She said all of this in a level, practiced voice that had the particular quality of a speech rehearsed for rejection. Hazel listened to the whole thing. "Can you do heavy kitchen work?" she asked. "Lifting, long hours on your feet, the heat of the stove in summer?" Nora looked at her carefully, recalibrating. "Yes." "The work pays fair and the housing is the bunkhouse annex. Private room, small, but yours. Your daughter can be with you in the mornings before the service starts. I'll need you to manage a meal service solo twice a week while I'm handling procurement." She paused. "You'll need to tell me honestly if there's anything on that list you can't do." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I can do all of it," she said. "Why are you—" She stopped herself. "Why am I what?" "Not asking more questions," Nora said. "About the situation. About why I'm here alone." Hazel looked at her. "Because it's not relevant to the work," she said. "And because I've been in a situation where someone's circumstances were used as a reason not to see what they were actually capable of, and I don't do that." Nora shifted the child on her hip. The little girl was watching Hazel with the candid evaluation of very young children who haven't yet learned to look away from things they're curious about. "When do I start?" Nora said. "Tomorrow morning," Hazel said. "Come at 5. She went back inside and told Colton at supper that they had a new kitchen hand starting tomorrow, and she needed the bunkhouse annex room to be cleaned out and the cot to have a proper mattress. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of a smile. Something in the eyes, not always reaching the mouth. "All right," he said. "She has a small child," Hazel said. 2 years old. "All right," he said again. She went back to her supper. The thing about building something from a place of damage, and she'd thought about this enough to have actual views on it, was that you never quite finished building. You got to a point where the structure was sound, where the foundation held and the walls were real and the roof didn't let the weather in, and you could stand inside it and feel the solidity of what you'd made. But you didn't stop building. You didn't reach a morning where you woke up and thought, finished, done, safe forever. What you reached was something different, something she didn't have a clean word for, but that felt, when she sat with it, like the difference between running from something and moving towards something. For a long time, for most of her life, if she was honest, she'd organized herself around not being hurt again, which meant keeping herself small, keeping her asks minimal, staying in the familiar damage because at least she knew its dimensions. What she'd found on the other side of that particular habit was not safety, exactly. The prairie still caught fire. Lyle had made 2 legal attempts on the property and might yet make a 3rd. The work was hard and the weather was bad, and there were days when she was tired in ways that went below the body and touched something deeper. None of that had gone away. What had gone away was the smallness, the particular internal posture of a person who'd decided in advance that she didn't deserve what she wanted. The posture was gone, and she hadn't noticed it going until one morning she woke up and tried to find it, and couldn't. She could not have told you exactly when it left. It hadn't been a moment. It had been accumulation, the feed order that worked, the water rights fight that they won, Rowley's hand guiding the pen, Colton at the fence line in the dark, saying equal like it was the most obvious thing in the world. On an evening in late autumn, 3 years after she'd arrived at the Briggs Hartley, on a wagon bench with her satchel in her lap, Hazel stood at the south-facing window of the room that was still hers, that had expanded now into a proper set of rooms in the extended main house, but which still had the same window and the same afternoon light moving across the floor. and looked out at the ranch. Emmett was in the yard, working with one of the young horses, patient and consistent in the way he'd learned to be patient. Delphine was visible through the kitchen window, doing something that was producing steam and a smell that carried even to here, which meant she was trying the new stew variation she'd been arguing for, and Hazel had finally conceded on the grounds that the argument itself had made the stew sound worth trying. Nora's daughter Bess, now 4, was sitting on the kitchen step with a piece of bread in each hand and the serene expression of a child who had organized the world to her satisfaction. The north pasture fence was repaired. The feed for winter was in. The garrison contract had been renewed for a 3rd year at terms that Hazel had negotiated with a confidence she'd needed to manufacture the first time, and didn't need to manufacture anymore. She heard Colton's boots on the floor behind her. He came and stood beside her at the window, looking at the same yard, and she felt the familiar steadiness of him. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but real in the specific way that mattered. "Feed numbers look good," she said. "I know," he said. "I looked at them this morning." "The Harker's Mill contract needs renewal in March." "I know that too." "I'm not done," she said. "I know," he said. "I've known you for 3 years." She looked at the yard, at the small moving pieces of the life she'd built here. Built. Not found. Not been given. Built from the specific materials of her own stubbornness and the decision she'd made on a back step in Dry Creek Crossing to stop disappearing. There was something she wanted to say, and she turned it over for a moment, looking for the right words, and then decided the right words were probably just the true ones. "I spent a long time believing that the problem was me," she said. "The way I looked, the space I took up. I thought if I could just be small enough, quiet enough, useful enough in the right way, the world would stop having a problem with me." She paused. "It doesn't work that way. The world doesn't stop having a problem with you because you make yourself easier to ignore. It just loses interest. And you disappear." Colton was listening. He was good at listening. It was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. "What works," she said, "is being exactly what you are, taking up the space you need to take, doing the work at the level you're capable of, and not apologizing for it." She turned to look at him. "It took me a long time to learn that. I'm still learning it some mornings." He looked at her with the directness that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him in a boarding house dining room a long time ago, a man who looked at a person when he meant to see them. "You were never invisible," he said. "The people looking weren't paying attention." She held that for a moment. "No," she said, "they weren't." Outside, Bess had finished her bread and was investigating something near the fence post with the focused curiosity of 4 years old and the complete conviction that whatever she'd found was important. Emmett had gotten the young horse to stand still and was talking to it in the low voice he used, the one that worked on animals and anxious people alike. The afternoon light came through the window in its familiar angle and moved across the floor the way it always had. The Briggs Hartley was not a perfect place. It had never been a perfect place. It was a place with a flue that needed watching and fence lines that needed maintenance and complicated people who sometimes made it difficult and winters that tested everything you'd put in place against them. It was a place built by imperfect hands doing patient work, and it held together not because it was lucky, but because someone had decided it was worth holding together and done the work required. That was the thing, in the end. That was the whole of it. Not the destination, not the arrival. The decision. Made once, and then again, every morning when the work was waiting, to be the person who showed up. Hazel Rowan Mercer had made that decision on a back step in a town that had never seen her, in the dark, in the company of a 10-year-old boy who'd asked if she was scared and accepted the honest answer. She was still making it, every day. She was still here.